Welcome to the Fatigue Files, a podcast that explores fatigue conditions from as many angles as possible while pushing the boundaries of thinking about fatigue as a signal to the 21st century and beyond. Cutting-edge thinking, practical strategies, thought-provoking explorations. They're going to all be here, and I'm your host, Anna Greer, welcoming you to this edition of the Fatigue Files. So everybody, welcome to another edition of the Fatigue Files podcast. And I'm delighted today to have with me Dasya Rasa, who's a licensed clinical social worker, transpersonal psychotherapist, and she specialises in trauma, grief, and she is also a contemplative spiritual practitioner. And she has written a wonderful book of 30 meditations called Transfiguration, which I have been really enjoying dipping into. So, Eva, welcome. It's absolutely lovely to have you here.
Eva, thank you. I so appreciate your invitation, and I'm really delighted to be here.
It's brilliant. Now, I'm going to invite you, if you're willing to share with the audience your own experience with fatigue.
So, my experience with fatigue really started to be pronounced and kind of manifest in the late 80s. And I think it really kind of started to peak in 1989. I had been in Japan, in Tokyo, teaching at a college. And they had us working a really grueling schedule. We were working 6 days a week, 12 hours to 15 hours a day. It was very, very grueling. And I had an hour commute each way to a suburb of Tokyo. So I really was working round the clock. And by the end of the academic year there, I kind of bottomed out. My fatigue was relentless. I was having symptoms like brain fog. I was having some joint issues. I was having focus and concentration issues. But the main thing was, and sleep issues. I was having disruptive sleep. And it seemed like no matter what I did or any time I took off, I was not restoring. So rather than renew that contract, I opted to come back to the US. And I remember flying from Tokyo to LA and literally getting off the plane in LA and boarding a Southwest plane to Albuquerque with the plan to go to Santa Fe and take 6 months off to work on holistic healing. And that's what I did. I lived with another contemplative, very quiet contemplative life. I underwent acupuncture, dietary changes, holistic body work, some energy work. And while I wasn't 100% restored, I did improve over the 6 months. And I went back to California, where I had been living in the Bay Area and San Francisco Bay Area. And I took a job, and only a few weeks on the job, I started presenting with the severe fatigue again, and joint issues and mobility issues. And it became so visible that my boss pulled me aside and said, my brand new boss, and he pulled me aside and he said, if I didn't know any better, I would think you have MS because my wife has MS. I think you should see a doctor and see if you've got MS. And I ended up leaving that position, which I loved very much. It was with a public relations firm. It was the firm that did We Are the World.
Ooh, very cool.
And yeah, it was a great firm. But I couldn't sustain a 9-to-5, a linear 9-to-5. So I left, and I started my journey of seeing doctors, most of whom said there's nothing wrong, or they would say it's psychological, or, we don't know. Until I embarked on, I had really encountered this doctor who was affiliated with a top immunologist out of UCSF. University of California, San Francisco. And this was at the height of AIDS also. So this particular immunologist was doing heavy duty research into HIV and other immunological and neuroimmunological stuff. And the doctor I encountered was affiliated with him. And she ran all kinds of tests, and my Epstein-Barr titers were high. And initially she thought I had systemic lupus, possibly MS, and she ruled that out. maybe Epstein, and then she ruled that out. And after we went through this process of ruling things out, she finally said to me, I think you have this new condition or disease that's kind of a mystery disease called chronic fatigue syndrome. And back then, there wasn't much literature out about it. The conventional perception was that this wasn't a bona fide condition, and people were pretty pathologized for it. But that was the beginning of me being able to start to dive into what was out there to see if I could do anything to mitigate the symptoms or remedy. As a result of that, however, I had to leave, go out on disability. I had to get an attorney, fight for my disability for 2 years, even though I had paid into it for decades. I lost my work, had to leave my apartment. It was a very, very, very difficult, very hard and just terrifying time because intellectually I wanted to work. I kept taking jobs, everything from a paralegal in a blue chip law firm to teaching. And no matter what I did, just a few months in, I would go from remission back out of remission and relapse. And I couldn't sustain more than a max of a year. But even if I pushed myself through 6 months to a year, then it took me a year or two to get back into a place where I felt like I could, resume work. It was really a nightmare time of my life. I call it one of the darkest nights of my life. But I did go through everything from a rotation diet to look at dietary candida, detox, lifestyle change. But I got to a place where I literally was debilitated. I literally could not get out of bed. I was in bed 14, 16 hours a day, could not get restorative sleep, woke up feeling like a train hit me, dragged myself 10 feet from the bedroom to the bathroom. I literally could no longer cook for myself. I had a member of a Carmelite monastic community up in Napa Valley come down once a week who brought me groceries and helped me with some basic things. I mean, it was really, really a hard time for me. And I wouldn't wish this disease on anyone. It was just crushing. And it wasn't until, and I kind of lived like that over a period of 2 decades on and off. And, even put myself and finally finished graduate work. But I would start and stop. Everything I started, I had to stop and then start again. I wasn't able to just start and go straight through and finish like most people. And that was extremely frustrating for me because I've always been very goal-oriented and I know I have gifts I wanted to develop. So I felt, I just felt horrible. And it also activated underlying shame and low self-esteem from early childhood developmental trauma. Nobody around me understood, including my family. People did not understand. I mean, in the world's eyes, I was kind of like a loser, and I think the biggest turning point came for me was when I embarked on a law school program, which I had had my eyes set on for decades. Thrilled to get in, rising star there academically, absolutely took a love to jurisprudential thought and theory. And after my first year, got an amazing job at the Attorney General's office, which nobody gets after the first year, but I was a relentless little squeaky wheel and they finally hired me. And I was in the civil rights division, I had my eyes set on doing public interest work in civil rights. It was a dream opportunity to segue into this world. And a month on the job, I collapsed. And I went to the law school dean who really had taken me under her wing because she, like me, had been an educator. She was a teacher. And I told her what was going on. And she said, I want you to take a year medical leave. And of course, I was like, oh my God, I was aghast. Are you kidding? I'm just starting my second year. No. And she said, no, I really want you to do this and go get some serious medical attention, see what you can do to find out what's happening. And I thought it was just my chronic fatigue. But as it turned out, I was getting more and more and more sick, more and more and more debilitated. And I remember calling my mom and saying, I think I'm dying. Like something's wrong with me. Something's very bad with me. And long story short, after I left, I took my medical leave. Right after I took my medical leave, within a couple of weeks, a city bus in Sacramento hit me. I was getting out of my car and it swiped my car door and hit me. And that trauma kind of put me in a tailspin. And one thing led to another, where I was eventually sent to the chief of endocrinology, who diagnosed me with an autoimmune thyroid disease. And she said to me, had you not dropped out of law school when you did, you probably wouldn't have seen Thanksgiving this year. She said, you have probably had this undiagnosed for over 2 decades. Your numbers are horrific. Like you do feel like you're dying because like you're in very bad shape. And so she worked with me for about 10 months. And then it was time for me to return to my law program. And she said, I don't advise it. And I was devastated. I was absolutely devastated. And I said, why not? She said, well, you're brilliant enough that you can do it. You can go back and do it, but you probably won't see 50. And at that point, I was in my early 40s. She said, you probably won't see 50 because of the inherent stress that's involved in the career. And I had to do some serious soul searching, really serious soul searching. And I made one of the hardest decisions, heartbreaking decisions I've ever made, which was that I didn't return to finish my JD, which haunted me for years. Believe me, was not an easy decision. But I did it because I wanted to make sure that I could choose something more life-giving. And at the time, I had taken a part-time job as a crisis counselor. And from there, I decided to return to continue at that time, I had an MA in theology from the Jesuits, and I decided to, with the encouragement of a friend who had just started her PhD at Emory, she suggested I try to apply to a couple programs for an MDiv. So I applied to Vanderbilt Divinity School, got in, made the move to Tennessee to do that, and had my eye prayerfully discerning about whether I was going to go back after that and try to do the JD again, or, pick up where I left off, or maybe move toward another option I had considered for decades, which was to become a psychologist. At the end of the day, after much soul searching and really rending of my heart, because honestly, there is a part of me that is still very much in love with jurisprudential thought and theory and law. But I had to surrender that in order to move toward what I do now. So I entered a PhD program. Actually, it was a PsyD program in Berkeley to become a psychologist. And I, unfortunately, 6 weeks into that, was diagnosed with something else that was very life-threatening, and I had to leave to get some surgery and whatnot. But that really kind of pivoted me toward the work that I really feel like I ultimately was called, which is what I'm doing now, which is to help companion people on their radical healing, transformational, what I call a transfiguration journey of trauma and complex trauma, complicated grief, and post-traumatic spirituality and growth.
Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. You've certainly come a hard road, and you've walked the transfigurational path for sure. So draw together then over the early attachment type stuff with chronicity, with trauma. How do you see that landscape when you're thinking about it professionally and personally? How do you guide clients through that landscape?
So we know that much of complex PTSD is rooted in developmental trauma. And we know much of that is connected to attachment wounding early on. And we know now, and certainly, with the signature work of Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, and many others who have contributed, Peter Levine and others, to our understanding that the body is where trauma is incurred neurobiologically. It's where it is stored. And it is kind of the ground where people have the hardest time living with this unresolved trauma. And I certainly had attachment wounding from my early childhood, and I certainly had developmental trauma in my family of origin, and I had medical trauma on top of it from the time I was a little girl. And so when this trauma is being stored unresolved, it's almost as though there are memory capsules with this trauma. It's stored in these memory capsules, kind of metaphorically, but it's unresolved, meaning it's still it lies dormant, and yet it gets activated, often without our conscious awareness. And one way it manifests is through our incarnational being, right? This is our human condition, our incarnationalness, our beingness. And it is on this body that all of these traumas are inscribed neurobiologically. And so the intersection of particularly chronic fatigue, autoimmune, gastrointestinal, other kinds of issues like RA, MS, lupus, systemic lupus, IBS, Crohn's, and ME, CFS, the list goes on. There is an intersection. There's a correlation. And as we start to resolve the traumas and also look at a whole constellation of, let's say, variables that contribute to either mitigating or exacerbating the trauma, such as diet, for example, or lifestyle, or how we manage or don't manage our stressors, then we can move toward resolution of the trauma, and then the trauma becomes transformed. And when something is transformed, it's energy, but the energy shifts. The kind of energy that it shows up as shifts. If it's unresolved and it's lying there dormant, it's a lot of heavy stuff we're carrying in our cells, in our, mitochondria, like very, very impacting on our entire immune system, our entire autonomic nervous system.
Absolutely. And it takes a lot of unconscious energy, doesn't it, to hold those traumatic energies down as well. So when you're working with clients, I imagine that's like some of my clients. You get clients whose response to trauma is to leave the body, to actually cut off, in a sense, from their somatic field. How do you work to get people attuned to their body, to feel safe again with the kind of experiences, energies, and movements of the body around old pain, around old trauma?
That's an excellent question, and it's a very relevant one, because it's a bit of a paradox, isn't it? Here we have our body, the landscape or the terrain, our incarnational terrain that holds the trauma, and yet, because of what we know now of the neurobiology of trauma, very often people will either go into a sympathetic nervous system response of flight, run, or fight, right? Hyperarousal, or they'll go into something called freeze. And out of freeze, there's kind of a sub part of freeze that behaviorally is called fawning, which is really please and appease. And that's basically behaviorally, we look to please and appease to neutralize our perceived threat. And when we go into freeze, or even fawning, or fold, collapse, we dissociate. So we disconnect from both our affective and our embodied sense, like felt sense of our embodiment. We dissociate. And my belief is that when we dissociate, let's say our authentic self gets fragmented, fractured. You could use words like splintered, fractured, fragmented, aspects, facets, parts, but these are fragmented aspects of ourselves that then get kind of frozen in the trauma. And in order for us to survive, this is what our brain does, so that we don't have a psychotic break with reality. And so survivors of trauma can go years, decades without really ever having a felt sense of their own body, their own embodiment. And to do so could feel very threatening and very injurious. So when we're working with what David Grand, the founder of Brain Spotting, would say is dissociative identity adaptation, or some brain spotting professionals I've worked with who specialize in dissociation call it dissociation identity phenomena, We don't call it dissociation identity disorder because we don't believe there's anything disordered about our brain putting us into that freeze and disconnect mode in order to survive. But when we're dealing with folks like that, we have to do what's called resourcing. And that means we have to help them to begin in very baby steps to reconnect to their somatic felt sense. It's not an event, it's a process. It takes time. We have to do it in slow steps. And we have to make sure that it's done in a therapeutic container relationship where people feel safe. Because people cannot go from being dissociated most of their life to suddenly feeling. It can be very overwhelming and it can re-traumatize them. They can get flooded with emotions and become dysregulated emotionally again. So when I work with clients that come in with, and many, I would even say most of my clients have a history of dissociative, let's say, survival mechanism. We first work on helping them to feel connected to their body. And that could be something, depending on the client. Some clients, I would not begin with breath because even attending to the breath could be really re-triggering. With others, I might just do kind of somatic exercises, like somatic experiencing exercises, so to speak, to use Peter Levine's terminology. And after we do that for a while, then we would start maybe some brain spotting and eventually get to a place where we do brain spotting and what's called parts work, where we can attend to inner child healing or other parts or other facets or fragments that got split off during dissociative experience. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. This term brain spotting, I think I'd love you to explain what brain spotting is and how it works, because I think a lot of people might not have come across it. So what is it and how does it work, Ava?
Okay, so brain spotting is a trauma therapy that grew out of EMDR. Its founder is Dr. David Grand. He is also an LCSW, and he's out of New York City. And David had been working in EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, right? I think founded by Dr. Shapiro. And he had been really working substantively in EMDR. And David tends to work with high-end athletes and performers, among other people. He's worked internationally long before he discovered brain spotting. But one day he was working with an ice skater, a professional ice skater, young adolescent ice skater, who had challenges with a particular, I think it was the triple loop, in their routine. And David was doing an EMDR session, as he had done with this person for about a year. And EMDR involves bilateral movement of the eyes. So and he was working with her in person, this is well before the pandemic, back in the early, I think it was like 2003. And he was using his hand, 2 fingers up, moving back and forth to invite bilateral eye movement. And as he was moving his hands, which is part of the protocol for EMDR, something intuitively told him to hold his hands still, which is not part of the protocol, because he noticed the client's eyes were wobbling. Something told him to hold his hands still, and he did. And then he witnessed the client processing trauma at a depth and a level he had not seen in the year he had been working with this person. And the next day, the client contacted David and told him for the first time she was able to do the triple loop. Following this processing of developmental trauma that unfolded in that session. And that got him thinking about relevant eye position to subcortical limbic activity. And he started exploring the connection between those two. And over time, this led to the discovery of what he termed brain spotting. So brain spotting, it's a neuroexperiential therapeutic model. It works on, both the brain and the body and relationally. And it has to do with a relevant eye position that we identify And we can call that a brain spot. It can be a gaze spot. It can be a resource spot. It can even be a body spot. And then we used focused mindfulness on that spot to process and desensitize, process, and resolve trauma. And there are beginning levels of brain spotting and advanced. I'm a certified, more advanced en route to becoming a consultant as a brain spotter and trainer. And it's a very efficacious, transformative modality. I myself have undergone both EMDR and brain spotting, bar none, has been more efficacious than just about any other neurosomatic modality I've engaged in. It's really profoundly transformational. And it is something that is fairly rapidly moving. It doesn't take, months or years to see results. People can see results in 2 to 4 sessions, and more.
So can you just clarify for me some of the kind of, I want to try and understand what's going on there, because it seems to me that it is related to the way in which the brain stores information geographically.
Right.
So, time is often stored in a kind of linear awareness, and then maybe there are kind of, sometimes when I'm working with rapid synaptic change work, I might ask a client where they're seeing an experience, and it'll be close or far away from them. It'll have certain characteristics because the brain is storing the kind of information. It's almost as if there's a matrix or a map operative where the material is stored. So it sounds similar to that, and that's just my naive take, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds a bit like what happened is when those eyes were wobbling, that was a kind of signal of very rapid processing of something that her gaze hooked onto. So there was the spot, the visual cortex was giving the signal to where the brain had stored the information in her field of awareness. So for her, it was sort of, she was looking up to the right or whatever. He spotted it, and he saw the movement and paused there because he recognized that some sort of rapid synaptic process was taking place, that the eyes were signaling. It sounds almost like a hyper fast REM state almost. So that's all just my very impressionistic sense of it. So what's going on there?
Yeah. And I'll do my best to address that. I am involved in more formal research right now, and I'm kind of taking a deep dive into the kind of physiological, neurobiological aspects of brain spotting. But what you just described, I think, is a beautiful, very resonant kind of take on it. We know that the ocular nerve is connected to the subcortical area, right? And that it does identify in our visual field, but also for people who are visually impaired, they can also do brain spotting, which is curious, right? But it's possible. And people can also do brain spotting with their eyes closed. That said, just to work with kind of the idea of the external outward gaze, right? That there is a connection between where we look. Now, look, sometimes I'll use my wand to identify those spots in a person's visual field. And other times people will come in and they've already identified the gaze spot because they'll start talking about whatever it is that's activating them or causing them trauma. And they're looking into the upper right, let's say. And then they might talk about how so-and-so was of great support and help. And they might talk about how they found relief, and they'll start looking toward the left. So they might identify these two, what we call gaze spots. But yes, what you said is true. There is, I don't know the details enough physiologically to know if it's reflecting something similar to REM sleep, but I do know that it's activating these kind of memory capsules, as I referenced earlier, that have unprocessed stored memories. And those memories are locking into, because of our ocular nerve being connected to our subcortical area, identifying, like you said, they're almost like little filing cabinets in our brain and places in the geography of our subcortical and our limbic system that get activated. And so somebody might come into me and say, I want to work on a car accident I had a month ago. And it was really terrifying. And now when I get in the car, I become extremely anxious. I don't even want to drive. And we will find a brain spot that they will identify in their visual field. We'll start mindfully focusing, usually using bilateral music as an adjunct. And some people don't talk, but most people do. And they'll start talking about a memory when they were 5. So it's almost as though starting with the car accident and a visual point in their field connects somehow, almost like it has tentacles to almost like a rhizome root, that it's almost like the beginning of a rhizome root that's also connected to multiple other unprocessed traumas that may be at the root. So somebody can come in and say, I want to start with the car accident, and they end up talking about what happened when they were 3 or 4 or 5.
And now I'm really wondering about this, because I think this is really interesting. And I wonder if that is carried by a kinesthetic sense in the memory that produces the rhizomatic hot cluster. Like, I wonder if it's actually a felt sense, even consciously or unconsciously, that links those things, that the familiarity echoes somewhere below consciousness in the unconscious field of the body, so that something about the car crash resonates with something earlier that the system recognizes and they build a narrative about it in that moment, because the unconscious is building that rhizomatic narrative. It's connecting all those things.
Right. And I would even argue that the unconscious narrative is really always playing at the body level.
Yes.
It's always kind of unfolding at the body level, even if it's not in our conscious waking awareness, that the body, because the body stores this, right, in our cells, that talking about the car accident and then memories that have been long stored and even not even realized they were there emerge out of the subcortical area that awaken something somatically that's connected.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well.
I don't think that it's like so the body and the trauma and our memories and our consciousness are so intimately interconnected. And I think the one of the portals is accessing this is through this neurosomatic, neuroexperiential brain spotting. So let me see if I can put it in another way. Traditional talk therapy, CBT, and a variety of other modalities, even DBT that I'm trained in, these are phenomenal modalities. They have their own gifts inherent. They are extremely effective for certain kinds of presentations in mental health. And that said, they do not have the inherent ability to bypass the neocortical activity and access our subcortical limbic system. And the stuff of our trauma is stored there, not in our neocortex where our executive faculties are, which is why people can understand intellectually what's going on, but their behavior and their emotions and their body sensations are on a different track. We have to bypass that neocortical and get to the subcortical.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go even further, some people actually use the neocortex as the very thing that enables them to escape that limbic subcortical material.
Oh, very much so. And that's also in some ways a coping mechanism, that kind of intellectualization, right? But it's also, curiously enough, connected to a narrative that some trauma survivors are so attached to, they're so married to, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They don't know any other narrative. They don't know that they can revise the narrative, which goes to the core of wounding of all trauma, which is agency. So when we have a rupture from trauma, we lose our agency, our sense of control and choice. And the narrative that we weave as a result of the trauma, often, which is not always reflective of all possibilities in our lives, but it becomes the narrative that's very rooted in the rupture. And so part of trauma transformational work, again, which I call transfigurational, is about, transforming the trauma on a neurobiological embodied level, and in the process, rewriting or revising our narrative, reappropriating and reclaiming, so that we can move from what I say in my book, rupture, to the last meditation, which is awe.
Yeah, beautiful. And that leads us very nicely into your book and the whole theme of transfiguration. And I'm very struck there by the relationship between transforming trauma and a spiritual journey. So I would love you to open that up, because lots of the audience are really drawn to spirituality. And I know that they would find that very enriching to open up that particular aspect of what you do.
So I believe that post-traumatic spiritual growth or post-traumatic spirituality is not only possible when we embark on a transformational, radically healing, transformational, transfigurational journey, but that it's inevitable. Now, why do I say that? I say that because, my hypothesis is that when we have a variety of ruptures, trauma ruptures, our, what I might call authentic or soul self, becomes fragmented. And in these fragmented aspects of ourselves, we tend to do what we have to do to survive. And we become very performative. And we become very focused on perfectionism, which is coming out of our shame, which is part of the rupture. We get focused on competition and doing over being in connectedness. We are very focused on the externals. And we often feel still very disconnected, like we're not sure exactly who we are. We're not sure that we have a self, or that we ever had a self, or that we're actually being ourselves. We kind of learn how to do this to navigate the waters of trauma. And as we move through what I call thresholds, which are portals or gateways, metaphorically, that we walk through en route to transforming these fragmented parts. And again, we would embark on some neurosomatic modalities like brain spotting and do parts work. But as we transform these parts and they become very much like a puzzle piece, if you can imagine a puzzle, and these fragmented parts are puzzle pieces, we start to interlock one to another. We're not going to fuse the pieces. They're not going to become fused, but we integrate them and they become transformed sufficiently that they become coherent, functionally, operationally, and collaborative into what we might call a unified or whole integrated self, which is not necessarily, they're not all conflated into a one dimension. We might still have a multiplicity of parts, but they are now operating functionally in a kind of cohesive, collaborative manner. And as we transform these fragmented parts, curiously, simultaneously, our authentic soul self continues to morph and emerge out of that. It's a both and. We are transforming the fragmented parts, they morph, and out of that transformational process, our more authentic soul self emerges. Well, in that sense, and I believe our authentic soul self is also, our most fully human self, but it also is where we hold the seat of our consciousness and our divine. So if we're really undergoing a radical healing, transformational, transfiguring process, it's inescapable that we're going to encounter these aspects of our authentic soul self. That's also where I believe we have the spark of divinity. And so then we also grow in our conscious awareness of both kind of, let's say, the sacred or the divine immanently, right, within ourselves and in all of creation, but also transcendently, well beyond ourselves in all of the cosmos. And that's been my experience, not only personally, but professionally, that even, and that's not the same as religious stuff. I have a subspecialty in religious trauma. It's not the same as religion or theology. We're talking about a conscious awareness of connectivity and interconnectivity with ourselves and our deepest authentic soul selves and the human divine aspects of ourselves and all of creation.
Which is absolutely stunning. I just love that. And my own experience working with people with fatigue, and indeed my own journey, would thoroughly endorse everything that you've said. And I find very frequently that people with these complex fatigue conditions are precisely on that journey. As you say, it's inevitable, but there is a sense in which they become more fully conscious, more fully alive to the meaning and importance of that journey, and can exercise agency by cooperating with the draw of that journey, the pull of that journey, the magnetic kind of pole star that leads us forward into that kind of transfigurative sense of expansion and connection with all that is. That's been absolutely beautiful talking with you, Eva. And to finish off, I just want to read this beautiful reverent reflection that you wrote, if that's okay, in your book, which I highly recommend people getting. It's a series of 30 meditations. In each one, Eva reflects on kind of psychological, spiritual aspects of trauma and stages of the journey, and that she produces an intentional invitation each time, which gives you a sort of question to reflect on or an activity to do. Really beautiful. And each one ends with a reverent reflection. And this one, Eva, I just thought was so perfect to finish our conversation. I think it draws in so many aspects of what we've spoken about. I'm just going to read it to everyone. Perpetually unfolding beneath stone and leaf and wild earth, I doggedly fling my hope towards the silhouette of a self still becoming. Absolutely stunning. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me, Eva, and with the audience. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful to you.
Well, I'll tell you, Anna, this has been a gift. And so thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope we'll cross paths again.